Yes. Ready? All right, so I'm going to say the same thing again, and you all act as if you didn't hear it. We've said the first time, but welcome to the fall 2018 Draper Workshop series on the history of human rights. My name is Manisha Sinha, the Draper Chair in American History at the University of Connecticut, and this is the third Draper Workshop series that we've had at the university. Now, today we have some of the best scholars working on the history of human rights, a huge subject with, of course, very diverse perspectives and genealogies, but they are here to share their work with us. Now, human rights is one of those topics that truly has a global and unarguably contested history. That is, there is no one hegemonic or dominant understanding of it today. Now, we can understand human rights as essentially a narrow bourgeois notion of individual rights, or from a more radical point of view, as ways in which the disfranchised, both in the West and those outside the West, the global South, have used or appropriated the concept of human rights to make freedom claims, redress instances of entrenched exploitation, and even expand the boundaries of democracy. So our panel today, I think, represents all these varying interpretive standpoints in the vast scholarship of human rights. I will shortly introduce our speakers in the order in which they will speak, each for 15 minutes, maybe 16, 17, but no more. And then we shall open up the floor to the audience for questions and answers, after which we will have a reception, also outside this room where we might get a chance to speak with our guests and engage with them on an individual basis. So before I do the introductions, I do want to thank Catherine Angelica, the Draper Research Assistant, for all her hard work with the logistics for this event. So I think and I would like to thank Jessica Muirhead, the Administrative Coordinator of the History Department, for all her help. Now, Katie will also be the person with the mic in the discussion section. So you make sure you raise your hand and she can see you if you have a question after our speakers are done. So without further ado, let me introduce our speakers. Our first speaker will be Samuel Moyn. Samuel Moyn is a professor of law at Yale Law School and a professor of history at Yale University. His areas of interest in legal scholarship include international law, human rights, the law of war, and legal thought, in both historical and current perspective. In intellectual history, he has worked on a diverse range of subjects, especially 20th century European moral and political theory. Now, he is the author of the acclaimed The Last Utopia, Human Rights in History, which was published in 2010, and most recently of Not Enough, Human Rights in an Unequal World. And the title of his talk is Human Rights in an Unequal World. Our second speaker is Manu Bhagavan, who is a professor of history and human rights at Hunter College in the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. He's also a senior fellow at the Ralph Bunche Institute. He's the author of The Peacemakers and Sovereign Spheres, and a co-editor of 4 other books. He is currently writing a biography of Madam Vijayalakshmi Pandit, who was the sister of Jawaharlal Nehru, the first Prime Minister of India. She was the world's first celebrity diplomat from the global South. The title of his talk is On Isolation and Fellowship, Ambedkar and Human Rights in India and Beyond. Our third speaker is Glenn Mitoma, who is an assistant professor of human rights and education, jointly appointed with the Human Rights Institute and the NEAC School of Education, Department of Curriculum and Instruction. He is also the director of the Thomas J. Dodd Research Center. Glenn's scholarship has focused on the history of human rights in the 20th century, with his first book, Human Rights and the Negotiation of American Power, examining the link between the coincident mid-20th century ascendancies of the US as the preeminent global power and human rights as a compelling global ethic. The title of his talk is 70 Years of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Reflections on Article 26. Our last speaker is Amy Dru Stanley, who is a history professor at the University of Chicago, where she works on slavery and emancipation, law, political economy, human rights, and gender. She is especially interested in the historical experience of moral problems. Her writing has appeared in academic journals, the most preeminent ones such as the American Historical Review and the Journal of American History, as well as in the New York Times, The Nation, Slate, Dissent Magazine, and Jacobin. She is the author of the prize-winning From Bondage to Contract, Wage Labor, Marriage, and the Market in the Age of Slave Emancipation. She's completing a book project, The Anti-Slavery Ethic and the Spirit of Commerce, An American History of Human Rights. The title of her talk is The Problem of Human Rights in the Age of Slave Emancipation. So I'll hand over the floor now to Samuel Moyn.
Well, thank you to Manisha for organizing this and inviting me. It's a privilege to be here, and especially on a panel with such scholars that I so admire, and thanks to those who helped organize it. So, however old you think human rights are, there's one thing that's really clear, which is that only in this generation have historians taken human rights as an important topic. Not that there aren't old books about the French Revolution or anti-slavery or the United Nations, but none of them make a big deal of the fact that actors in these various episodes and institutions sometimes talked about human rights. So the most interesting question about the history of human rights has to be, why are we doing it? And I think the answer is clear. We're looking for something to believe in during a confusing time and have thought that human rights are it. Well, I don't disagree that human rights are a big part of the politics we should pursue, but just a part. And so I'll try to tell my very idiosyncratic personal history of human rights now to reach that conclusion, because what's the point of history unless you have a political lesson to it? So let me tell my story in, given that I have 14 minutes, in 3 stages. The 19th century, the mid-20th century, and our time, whenever you think it started. So, to think about the 19th century, though I'm not an expert compared to my fellow panelists, I think we have to start by defining our terms. We can think about rights in general, which are age-old, going back at least to Roman times in the West, or human rights understood as entitlements that accrue to individuals in virtue of their human status. And what's altogether clear, I think, after now all the research that people have done for a decade, is that human rights in this sense are a few centuries old. And insofar as they've been pursued in politics and law, there's one right in particular that has been most frequently articulated and most zealously defended, and it's the right to private property, along a bit later with the right to freedom of contract without interference from the state. Now, European history, which I study, makes this utterly clear, but I think that we should talk about American history. At least we have 2 great US historians today, and they'll permit me to dabble in what they know. As far as I can tell, human rights did very much serve, before the Civil War, on occasion, abolitionists who said that the reason why slaves ought to be freed is that they enjoy human rights in virtue of their humanity. But that much older, much better defended human right to private property was also deployed, except on the other side. So if we want to be honest about it, we have to say that if anti-slavery was a human rights movement in its time, slavery was defended by its own human rights movement. After the Civil War, we find that the human right to freedom of contract, even as white supremacy was reimposed in the Old South, became maybe most closely associated in the United States with the rhetoric of human rights generally, which was also certainly the case in Europe. If you read cases like Lochner versus the state of New York, you find that moneyed elites and eventually a majority of Supreme Court justices for 30 years defended the freedom of contract against rising movements to limit working hours or allow collective bargaining and even articulate a right to strike by working men. They defended that freedom of contract in the rhetoric, sometimes, of human rights. Now, Karl Marx was onto this when he looked out at European history in the 19th century. As many reformers, including liberals, were as the 19th century ended and the 20th century began. He, of course, claimed that human rights could only ever be the rights of the bourgeoisie and their interests. And I don't think he was right about that, as I'll argue in a minute. But I think we have to acknowledge, looking at 19th century history, that he came by his illusions and mistakes honestly, because natural rights, certainly in the North Atlantic, did serve as the rhetoric through which capitalist interests were advanced and defended. But then something happened to prove Marx wrong. In the second stage, in the middle of the 20th century, the welfare state was founded, including in this country, although a rather unimpressive version of it. And along the way, rights were reinvented. All of those rights that Marx himself, in some of his more optimistic moods, and working men's movements later, and even socialist parties in countries that got them, or where they didn't die, as in this country, redefine rights in terms of the rights, let's call them, of white male workers, chiefly, although others claimed them. And those were centrally not just civil liberties, but rights that countervailed the right to private property and freedom of contract, like the right to work, the right to join unions and strike, but modern welfare rights that include the right to food and housing and health and sanitation and water. And yet it would be a grievous mistake to reduce this era in human rights history to these rights. Because the welfare state was never just about defending what we could call an ethics of sufficient provision, where everyone has a right to the most minimal decencies of life. Instead, it was about, if you like, constraining capitalism, not just seeking to build a floor of protection for every individual, but a ceiling on inequality. And we know that in the middle of the 20th century, even in the United States, welfare states were built that have achieved more distributive equality than in the 19th century before, or our time since. Always, these states worked within national borders. And so if we want to talk about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that famous document from 1948, I think we should read it in its time as little more than a great charter for national welfare. And all the great politicians of the time, Jawaharlal Nehru, who may come up later, were incarnating the sort of victorious ideology of the mid-20th century, which I would call national welfarism. If you want to get really controversial, you could call it national socialism, with a small n and a small s. It's not that there weren't internationalists, but the main goal was to defend the national community against the buffeting winds of the first era of economic globalization and the freedom of contract and sanctified right to private property that it had canonized. Internationalists didn't get very far insofar as they wanted to make rights something that would protect individuals against their own national welfare states, especially when they slid into despotism. So then we reach our time, and that's the time when human rights genuinely does take off, as all of our evidence shows in terms of the public salience and the use of the phrase to brand movements, really for the first time. And what's remarkable about that moment is that it became a civil libertarian idea. Amnesty International was founded, later many other NGOs, but while it was fantastic that they pursued civil liberties, attacking unjust imprisonment, torture, and later some other things, they did so by forgetting about national welfare, including the economic and social rights that had been central to the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights only 30 years before. Now, in fairness, and it's very important, that unlike in the 19th century, human rights in our time, since the 70s, have never reverted to being associated with the narrow defense of contracted property. Advocates of free enterprise and free trade did win, but they almost lost if they ever attempted to kind of reclaim the rhetoric of human rights. They didn't take over Amnesty International. They just founded the WTO, the World Trade Organization, and took over both American political parties, like both the political parties in whatever country you want to talk about, notably in the global north, with its familiar left-right split between conservatives and social democrats. Nothing wrong with that, necessarily. I think it was a huge achievement that internationalism broke through for many people at this moment, after decolonization and its borders. And human rights became a way of stigmatizing foreign states for their misconduct in ways that had really never been all that central, at least to the evidence as I've seen. And yet there was one tragedy, which is that even when human rights law began to protect sufficient minima when it comes to basic decencies, when NGOs like Amnesty International and many others began to pursue economic and social rights in the spirit of a global campaign against poverty, the world forgot about distributional equality. That ideal that had been central to the welfare state was lost in our age of human rights history, which became not just the era of the victory of human rights ideologically, but also the era of the victory of the rich. So what do we do if this history isn't all plausible? Well, not ditch human rights, which are good things even if they're defined in their narrowest terms as civil liberties. But I think we can't rest content with human rights either. In a world where most jurisdictions, most nations have seen inequality skyrocket, and global inequality, which many advocates of decolonization hope to end, remains a significant feature of world affairs. The main thing you have to know about the life chances of any human being remains today where he or she is born, in what country, on what continent. And so I think if that's true, we need to tell the history of human rights to lead us not just to remember human rights, but the egalitarian ideals that have been lost along the way. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Manisha, for your kind introduction at the outset of the event and for inviting me here today as well. Thanks also to Catherine and Angelica for all of her assistance and to all of you for being here this afternoon. It's an honor to participate in the Draper Workshop and to be part of this distinguished panel along with Sam, Glenn, and Amy. And Sam, thank you for your, as always, provocative opening. I'm going to speak this afternoon on Bhimrao Ambedkar, known as Baba Saheb, and his navigation of caste oppression in 20th century India. My remarks draw from a larger paper which I have co-written with my student Anjali Kapoor and which is forthcoming in a book releasing next week. Ambedkar belonged to a community of people who had come to be known as untouchables. He challenged such terms and the ordering of society that produced them, calling himself and those he represented Dalit, meaning the oppressed. Today he is remembered as one of India's first human rights lawyers, or perhaps the first, and in his capacity as chair of the drafting committee, the father of India's constitution. The practice of caste in Hindu traditions alienated Ambedkar right from his early childhood, from the practice of faith, from his peers, and from society. Ambedkar's Dalit human, somewhat akin to Giorgio Agamben's Homo sacer, was expunged from society and left in the alleys of isolation. Ambedkar saw such isolation as a threat to basic living and a matter of existential urgency. He had to confront the ways in which individual and society could be rethought to escape the interconnected and forced prisons of caste, religion, and the modern state. He framed his solution in universalistic terms and described his aim as human rights. This talk is divided into several sections. The first, the isolated self. Ambedkar's sense of isolation evolved from his searing personal experiences and the daily cruelties of the caste system. His handwritten autobiographical sketch, Waiting for a Visa, is satirically titled To Convey the Realm of Exclusion Inhabited by Dalits. This is exemplified in a story from his childhood, when 9-year-old Ambedkar went to visit his father in another town and could not get anyone to take him and his siblings from the railway station to their onward destination, the cartman, fearing pollution at the children's very touch. On the insistence of the station master, one of the cartmen finally agreed to accompany the children by charging double the regular fare and walking all the way while Ambedkar and his siblings drove the cart. The children had to travel the complete distance without any water and in fear of the cartman. Ambedkar and his family finally reached his father's house the next morning, taking 12 hours to complete what was otherwise a 3-hour journey. This childhood episode, in all of its terror and odious degradation, helped Ambedkar realize the primacy of caste in South Asian society, and that even bodies, especially bodies, were untouchable before they were human. Ambedkar went on to study at Columbia University, working with professors like John Dewey, James Shotwell, Edwin Seligman, and James Harvey Robinson. But he had to interrupt his studies as his funding was over, and he had to execute the bond on his scholarship. He returned to India and headed to the erstwhile princely state of Baroda to serve Sayaji Rao Gaikwad III, as the Maharaja had paid for his studies at Columbia. The Maharaja of Baroda, well known for being progressive, wanted to appoint Ambedkar as the state's finance minister after he gained some administrative experience in various departments. Yet when Ambedkar reached Baroda, in spite of the Maharaja's order, no one received him at the train station, a stinging reminder of the indignity he had suffered as a child. Ambedkar recalled, 5 years of stay in Europe and America had completely wiped out of my mind any consciousness that I was an untouchable, and that an untouchable, whenever he went in India, was a problem to himself and to others. That leads us from the isolated self to the isolated community. In 1919, for the first time, Ambedkar talked about the hallmarks of caste in India. Each group, he said, tends to create its own distinctive type of like-mindedness. But where there are more groups than one to be brought into political union, there would be conflict among differently like-minded. And so long as the groups remain isolated, the conflict is bound to continue and prevent the harmony of action. It is the isolation of the groups that is the chief evil. How to overcome such isolation? Ambedkar saw society as a collection of castes, each of which functioned as an interested group. He thought untouchability was not justified according to any legal code, and rather drew its support from historical custom. He observed, untouchability is an outward expression of the inner repulsion which a Hindu feels towards a certain person. The biggest problem of Dalits was the social isolation forced upon them by caste Hindus. Scriptural and social codes prescribing acts of commission and omission officially sanctioned the isolation of Dalits. The untouchables must live in separate quarters away from the habitation of the Hindus. It is an offense for the untouchables to break or evade the rule of segregation. Mincing no words, Ambedkar continues, the Hindus therefore are not merely an assortment of castes, but are so many warring groups, each living for itself and for its selfish ideals. The rules of secluding Dalits were just among the multitudes of commands and prohibitions to deter any common front against the caste system. All are slaves of the caste system, but all the slaves are not equal in status. He was clear about the consequences. Isolation means social segregation, social humiliation, social discrimination, and social injustice. Isolation means the denial of protection, the denial of justice, the denial of opportunity. Isolation means want of sympathy, want of fellowship, and want of consideration. That leads us from the isolated community to the isolated nation. Ambedkar asks, how can they, that is Dalits, end their social isolation? The one and the only way to end their social isolation is for the untouchables to establish kinship, which is free from the spirit of caste. Kinship acts as an antidote to isolation. Where shared traits and similarities on the basis of language or culture could be found, barbed wire fencing off human from human could now be torn down. But kinship could not be a curative for the poison of isolation. At best, it could only slow it down. For Ambedkar, isolation will eventually overtake kinship, precisely since kinship's ultimate manifestation, nationality, too relies upon the segregation of like-minded communities. He writes, nationality is a social feeling. It is a feeling of a corporate sentiment of oneness, which makes those who are charged with it feel that they are kith and kin. This national feeling is a double-edged feeling, though. It is at once a feeling of fellowship for one's own kith and kin, and an anti-fellowship feeling for those who are not one's own kith and kin. It is a feeling of consciousness of a kind, which on the one hand binds together those who have it so strongly that it overrides all differences arising out of economic conflicts or social gradations, and on the other hand, severs them from those who are not of their kind. It is a longing not to belong to any other group. This is the essence of what is called a nationality and national feeling. In this conception, fellowship is the good that Ambedkar sees in kinship, and it is anti-fellowship that is produced when kinship reaches its limits, the outer boundaries of the groups it seeks to create. Ambedkar discerns that kinship and its derivative nationality are therefore ultimately exclusionary. Neither can fully end isolation since they both rely upon it. And this leads Ambedkar to conclude that the real solution he seeks to the problem of caste and to all social ill is to be found in a fellowship that goes beyond nationality. And that leads us to the anti-isolation fellowship. Ambedkar. Gandhiji, I have no homeland. Gandhi. You have got a homeland, Doctor. And from the reports that have reached me of your work at the Round Table Conference, I know you are a patriot of sterling worth. Ambedkar. You say I have got a homeland, but still I repeat that I am without it. How can I call this land my own homeland and this religion my own, wherein we are treated worse than cats and dogs, wherein we cannot get water to drink? The injustice and sufferings inflicted upon us by this land are so enormous that if knowingly or unknowingly we fall prey to disloyalty to this country, the responsibility for that act would be solely hers. I do not feel sorry for being branded as a traitor, for the responsibilities of our action lie with the land that dubs me a traitor. If at all I have rendered any national service, as you say, helpful or beneficial to the patriotic cause of this country, it is due to my unsullied conscience and not due to any patriotic feelings in me. If in my endeavor to secure human rights for my people, who have been trampled upon in this country for ages, I do any disservice to this country, it would not be a sin. I have been striving to win human rights for my people without meaning or doing any harm to this country. Here, in one of the first exchanges between Ambedkar and Mahatma Gandhi, the former rejects territory and state as a means of achieving equality and justice. Instead, Ambedkar saw such worthy goals as attainable only through a universalistic framework, such as that provided by human rights. While at first glance, the concern in his conversation with Gandhi may be directed solely at the Dalit community, in fact, he specifically rejects such narrow concern. Ambedkar is certainly after securing rights for his people, but he is attentive to the fact that such a limited objective would ultimately only be confounded by recalibrated forms of isolation. Justice for Dalits thus was by necessity to be found only through a type of social force that went beyond kinship, what Ambedkar calls fraternity. He writes, an ideal society should be mobile, should be full of channels for conveying a change taking place from one part to other parts. In an ideal society, there should be many interests consciously communicated and shared. There should be varied and free points of contact with other modes of association. In other words, there must be social endosmosis. This is fraternity, which is another name for democracy. In this complicated passage from Ambedkar's tour de force, Annihilation of Caste, Ambedkar lays out a triad of interrelated concepts that he sees as fundamentally antithetical to isolation: democracy, endosmosis, and fraternity. Ambedkar borrowed the concept of endosmosis from his mentor, John Dewey, to describe the fluidity of communication between groups. Arun Mukherjee clarified that the term was used originally by Henri Bergson and later by William James to describe the interaction of the mind with nature. Dewey appropriated it as social endosmosis, to break the barriers of stratification between the privileged and the subject class. The notion of fluidity for Ambedkar becomes critical to end isolation. Such fluidity determined the extent to which life, both political and everyday, could be harmonious. The more connections that could be made, the greater the ability to create a new like-mindedness. Ambedkar expanded on Dewey's conviction of blurring the dichotomy between the privileged and the subject class to narrow the gap between the citizen and the human. This is where democracy came in. For democracy, in Ambedkar's view, was not just a form of government, but a way of associated living, of conjoint communicated experience. It is essentially an attitude of respect and reverence towards fellow men. This concern for other people, fraternity, Ambedkar saw as the base value for true ethics. For Ambedkar, fraternity would also be a tool for reconstructing the idea of a nation based on inclusive democracy. The roots of such a democracy, according to Ambedkar, lie in the social relationships tied together in a society based on mutuality of sympathy and cooperation. The perils of choosing the political form of democracy without its social meaning became the highlight, as well as the warning, of a major speech Ambedkar gave in the Constituent Assembly of India in 1949 on the eve of the launch of India's new constitution, which he helped draft. Political democracy cannot last unless there lies at the base of it social democracy. What does social democracy mean? It means a way of life which recognizes liberty, equality, and fraternity as the principles of life. These principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity are not to be treated as separate items in a trinity. They form a union of trinity in the sense that to divorce one from the other is to defeat the very purpose of democracy. Without equality, liberty would produce the supremacy of the few over the many. Equality without liberty would kill individual initiative. Without fraternity, liberty and equality could not become a natural course of things. Now, despite his use of terms associated with Western thought, and despite his high personal regard for his mentor Dewey, Ambedkar rejected any claim that his vision derived from the Euro-American world. Positively, my social philosophy may be said to be enshrined in three words: liberty, equality, and fraternity. Let no one, however, say that I have borrowed my philosophy from the French Revolution. I have not. My philosophy has roots in religion and not in political science. I have derived them from the teachings of my master, the Buddha. In his philosophy, liberty and equality had a place, but he added that unlimited liberty destroyed equality, and absolute equality left no room for liberty. He gave the highest place to fraternity as the only real safeguard against the denial of liberty and equality. And fraternity was another name for brotherhood, or humanity. Ambedkar's human, Mukherjee writes, is not the atomistic, isolated individual of Enlightenment thought, but the individual always already embedded in the social. The social for Ambedkar had to transcend any limitations of the local or the national, for it was only in the universal, that is the universal social, that democracy could find its full flowering. Ambedkar gradually became more aware of the confusion that his use of the term fraternity created. The word fraternity is not an adequate expression, he said. The proper term is what the Buddha called Maitri. One of the 10 virtues in Buddhism, Maitri, loosely translates to fellowship. A hand must be given not only to those who are friends, but to those who are foes as well. Moreover, the Buddha charged humanity with cultivating the spirit of Maitri for all living beings. Is not Maitri necessary? What else can give to all living beings the same happiness which one seeks for one's own self? To keep the mind impartial, open to all, with affection for everyone and hatred for none. In its universal and global extension, the flow of Maitri surrounds and binds humanity together, opening associated living channels between not just communities, but nations as well. Conjoint communication, steadfastly moored to respect and reverence, could then, Ambedkar concludes, go beyond the limits of even kinship to forge a new harmonious whole, human whole, in balance with the natural world. I'm on my last bit here. So now, he's talked about the anti-isolatory effects of fellowship. Now he wants to constitute it. Ambedkar was determined to make his vision of the whole human more than just airy talk. In the 1949 speech before the Constituent Assembly of India, where he laid out his concept of social democracy, he also made clear that the Constitution he helped to shepherd to its moment of adoption was not an end in itself, but rather a means to a larger end. It was the role and responsibility of everyone who believed in the document and the larger values for which it stood to actively participate in making the dream into reality. He said, connecting the isolation of the self and that of the community with the liberation of fellowship. In India, there are castes. These castes are anti-national. In the first place, because they bring about separation in social life. They are anti-national also because they generate jealousy and antipathy between caste and caste or community and community. But we must overcome all these difficulties if we wish to become a nation in reality. For fraternity, by which here he means Maitri, or fellowship, can be a fact only when there is a nation. Without fraternity, equality and liberty will be no deeper than coats of paint. Significantly, Ambedkar did not believe that merely naming the isolationist effects of caste and theoretically celebrating the idea of fraternity would in themselves achieve anything, since India had also to move practically beyond kinship and community. He wrote, "I am of the opinion that in believing that we are a nation, we are cherishing a great delusion. How can people divided into several thousands of castes be a nation? The sooner we realize that we are not, as yet, a nation, in the social and psychological sense of the word, the better for us. For then only we shall realize the necessity of becoming a nation, and seriously think of ways and means of realizing the goal. The Indian Constitution, as a result, does not establish the nation, but rather provides the tools to help achieve it." I've cut the details on how, in fact, he tried to implement this, but I'm happy to come back to this in the discussion if anyone is interested. My takeaway, though, by way of conclusion, is that Ambedkar demanded that humanity go beyond the nation. For only then could all the limits of kinship be transcended and the curse of isolation broken. To achieve this, a new like-mindedness was necessary, grounded in the triad of endosmosis, democracy, and fraternity. The fluid communication between groups and the application of that communication on the basis of respect would ensure the destruction of exclusion and the creation of an integrated political space through which liberty and equality could take their fullest, most true forms, and where the idea of human rights had to exist to have any real meaning. Maitri, or fellowship, is the ultimate solution beyond the boundaries of caste, religion, and state, the pathway of true liberation. Now, as the world faces the dawn of a new, increasingly violent, global authoritarian moment, this prescriptive wisdom has perhaps never seemed more urgent. Thank you.
Hi everyone. I'll start with adding my thanks as well to Manisha and to Katie for organizing this and for inviting me to participate. And I do want to say, this is the first time we've met since you've been to campus, but I will tell you, I'm like a secret admirer. I've been admiring your work from afar, and I've really enjoyed actually what you've done with the Draper Chair, and that you're convening these kinds of workshops. I've really found refreshing and I think a real contribution to our intellectual community. So thanks and welcome, relatedly. Okay, so before I start, I also want to acknowledge that the land on which we're currently convened is the occupied territories of the Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Skagit-Cook, and Golden Hill Pagusset peoples who have stewarded this land throughout the generations. I'm also going to say I probably am abusing my home field advantage here. I've got some slides here, and maybe that's a cover for my thoughts being a little more half-baked than my esteemed panel. So I hope you'll indulge me. But the title of my talk is a kind of acknowledgement that we're in this 70th year anniversary, and my photo up there. I've got like a t-shirt. It used to be up there. My headshot, the grinning face that looks like this one, was taken at a rally. That's why I'm in a t-shirt. Everybody else has got like a tie. They look like they're professors. I look like a guy on Facebook, right? And that's because that's from a rally that we had in September, kind of inaugurating a series of events that recognize. Sorry, this is a callback. This is the first slide of my PowerPoint, which is riveting. But that means you have to watch me for a second. So I'm describing. We'll put it back up at the end. You'll see my head. Don't worry about it. It's not that great. This is a tangent, and I've wasted 4 minutes. But the point is, so I'm taking this opportunity of the 70th anniversary to drill back onto some of that drafting history and to look specifically at one particular article as a way of thinking through some potential future trajectories for historical work in the field of human rights. So that's really what I'm doing here. I'm going to start with something that's not particularly historical, but is also from this year and acknowledging the 70th anniversary. And this is from a remarkable address given by the outgoing High Commissioner for Human Rights, Zeid Ra'ad al-Hussein, in his last address to the Human Rights Council. This was back in June. And he says there, at one point, he says, "But then why is the Universal Declaration and the whole body of human rights law that followed it the object of so much attack today, not only from violent extremists like the Takfiris, but also authoritarian leaders, populists, demagogues, cultural relativists, some Western academics, and even some UN officials? I have spent most of my career at and in the United Nations. What I have learned is this. The United Nations is symptomatic of the wider global picture. It is only as great or as pathetic as the prevailing state of the international scene at the time. I have also come to understand how weak human memory is, that to many people, history matters only insofar as it can be unsheathed and flung into political battles. They do not view it in the service of deeper human understanding." That's a remarkable thing for a High Commissioner of Human Rights to say, and it really is a lament. And a lament I think we can take as a warning of the utter collapse of the international human rights system that's based at the United Nations. And that system, of course, was absurd from its beginning to park the effort to protect individuals against the power and abuses of states in an entity that is entirely dominated only by state representatives. So it's quite a moment. Now I'm going to shift to another anniversary year. This one only 10 years out from the Universal Declaration. This is in 1958. And this one, these remarks are by another kind of surprising figure, Eleanor Roosevelt. Many of you will know is the chair of the Human Rights Commission during the drafting of the UDHR in the 1940s. And this was at this kind of impromptu event at the UN. The American Jewish Committee was delivering a copy of a new community action guide they had just drafted to the then chair of the Human Rights Commission. And so Eleanor's there because her friend is the author of this thing, and she's asked to say something. And famously, this is an oft-repeated quote. She says at a certain point, "Where, after all, do universal human rights begin? In small places close to home. So close and so small, they cannot be seen on any map of the world. They are the world of the individual person. The neighborhood he lives in, the school or college he attends, the factory, farm, or office where he works. Such are the places where every man, woman, and child seeks equal justice, equal opportunity, equal dignity without discrimination. Unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere. Without concerted action by citizens to uphold them close to home, we shall look in vain for progress in the larger world." Now, for those of us who are familiar with the trajectory of human rights after the 1940s and into the 50s, you probably are hearing in what appears on the surface as an exhortation as really another lament. A lament of the failure of the UN to make any conceivable progress past the declaration on the conventions. These are the binding international treaties that were supposed to be the follow-up, right? Those would languish in committee for another 10 years before they were open for signature, and then another 10 years after that before they actually went into effect. So that legal armature that was promised after the Second World War was slow to non-existent in coming. What the UN was busy doing was not upholding peace, but actually going to war in Korea, and became the site of the intensification of the Cold War. Another symbol of the downward trajectory of human rights at that very meeting was standing right next to Eleanor Roosevelt. UN, the American representative to the Human Rights Commission was also there, a woman by the name of Mary B. Lord, who was mostly famous for being the heiress to the Pillsbury flour mill empire and the chair of Roosevelt's New York, the chair of Eisenhower's New York campaign committee. And so the contrast between Roosevelt and Lord really signaled the decline of human rights within the larger American frame and to some extent the world. So from what we know, this status of human rights in the 50s makes it not hard to imagine Roosevelt's tone was something less than celebratory. From what we know. So in what remains of the time I want to open up a little bit on this question of what we know via a short inquiry into Article 26 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, this document. Again, we're marking the 70th anniversary. I know you all have your plans for the platinum anniversary in December. You've got your column, and it's platinum garland all set. I know my family's all a titter about it. But this document that we're recognizing and this particular article, the right to education in the UDHR. In doing so, I hope to unsettle a little bit of the settled history of human rights that emphasizes its legal and political dimensions to the exclusion of other questions, and to draw us in particular to considering some of the more prosaic ways human rights principles, values, and aspirations inform how individuals understand their lived experiences. In other words, how human rights might come to color the world of the individual person. Okay, so I'm putting this up here so we can all read along. So we're going to start, I'm going to break down the article by its various paragraphs and try and meditate a little bit on that drafting history and what maybe that tells us about where we might look for new insights into this history. It's worth noting that Article 26 is the longest article in the entire Declaration. At one point, there was a period where they were trying to slash words and cut it back, and Rene Cassin and P.C. Chang were all making these drastic cuts and at one point it was just down to this first sentence. Everyone has the right to education. But they kept adding more, and it kept creeping back, and it kept enlarging. And I think that tells us a lot about where this right fits in the framework of the drafters. So at any rate, so the first paragraph says everyone has the right to education. Education shall be free, at least in the elementary and fundamental stages. Elementary education shall be compulsory. Technical and professional education shall be made generally available, and higher education shall be made equally accessible to all on the basis of merit. The general context, of course, of this right is that it's in that cluster of social and economic rights that that Sam indicated mark the document as really a kind of production of the mid-20th century aspiration to the welfare state. It's always important to emphasize how uncontroversial most of these rights were. They were assumed, they were not opposed, it was not opposed by the West. This kind of ascendant neoliberalism was still over the horizon, and everyone from the North, the South, the East, and the West embraced these as common sense. And that's especially true of education. Education was always in there in every draft of the document as it appeared. It's broadly rooted in many of the extant constitutions of member states at the time, which were the source material for the Secretariat's first draft. So France, Brazil, China, USSR all have education in there as a right in their constitutions. And of course, famously, the United States Constitution does not have the right to education, but it's important to note many of the state constitutions did, as well as the Roosevelt famous second Bill of Rights, right? That was part of a post-war expansion of rights rhetoric into the social and economic field. There in that second Bill of Rights, it was said the right to education, for work, for citizenship, and for individual growth and happiness. The Latin American states in particular were essential in insisting on the right to education being of importance. Many of those countries had undergone a series of revolutions, a redrafting of their constitutions, and education was a space in particular where the secularization of Latin American society had been an incredible point of contention. And embedding them within these frameworks, I think, or their insistence on embedding these within these frameworks recognizes the kind of top-of-mind quality that education had for many of them. This particular paragraph here signals the way in which education fit within the context of this modernized or modernizing industrial state, right? That the idea that a nation would have, or a state would be providing education to each and every one of its citizens is a mark of the transitions across the 19th century. The industrialization, the urbanization, entwined as well with the rise of nationalism. And I think this connects a little bit with Manu's talk in that, you know, education was imagined as the privileged space in which the crafting of these new national identities across traditional differences could and should take place. And it's important here to note that in the framework of a right to education, the notion of citizenship here isn't a legal question. It isn't simply a legal status that defines your relationship to the laws of the land, but is a consciousness about a relationship between you and your fellow citizens within a larger polity. This signals what's scary about this particular paragraph in the article. And it comes out most clearly in the notion that elementary education shall be compulsory. That word compulsory was one that was subject of lots of agita in the drafting committee. In fact, the Indian representative, Hanta Mehta, said, you know, why are we putting the word compulsory in a document that's supposed to be about human freedoms, right? You have to do it. And Charles Malik, the representative from Lebanon, was really scared that compulsory invested the state with a tremendous power to shape the minds of all members of society in a way that may be at odds with the other loyalties they may have as religious identities, as other kinds of social and cultural identities beneath the state. And so the upshot here, I think, about paragraph 1, which again was kind of common sense, they were going to include something, is that it signaled at once the ascendancy and common sense notion of a welfare state, but the other, what is ambivalent or what caused concern among the drafters about the powers that the UDHR might be investing in the state, which leads us to paragraph 2. So both paragraph 2 and paragraph 3 were not part of any early draft. These were introduced during the drafting procedures as the committee began to focus on what it meant to put an article like this in the Declaration. So this is obviously about the purposes of education. Education shall be directed to the full development of the human personality and to strengthening of respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. It shall promote understanding, tolerance, and friendship among all nations, racial and religious groups, and shall further the activities of the United Nations for the maintenance of peace. Now, it's not out of keeping in a number of those national constitutions that include the right to education to include these notions of particular purposes that education would have. The problem with all of those purposes is that they were often rooted in this call to nationalism. This call to a specific kind of national identity that set those citizens apart from every other national citizen. And that was anathema to a document that purported to be universal, but also struck many of the drafters as problematic because nationalism was understood by many of them as part of the cause of the Second World War. And this was brought to the fore most adamantly, not by one of the state representatives, but by one of the representatives from the observer NGOs, the World Jewish Council. During a session of the second drafting committee's meeting, they interrupted the proceedings to put forward this idea that if you put this in there, you put this article 1 or this paragraph 1 in there, what they proposed was that that's great, but many states that followed this prior to that, in fact, the most advanced educational state in the world prior to the Second World War, the one that came the closest to meeting the standards of paragraph 1 was Germany. And that the German state's armature of education was precisely part of its problem. Not only that it was effective, but it pulled the German youth away from other bonds that might have mitigated the effect of Nazi propaganda into the realm of being vassals of the state. So this was the argument put forward by the World Jewish Committee, and they proposed to come up with an antidote. What that antidote was is kind of weird, frankly, right? This notion of a full development of a human personality, and I know Sam has lots to say on the notion of human personality, promoting human rights and fundamental freedoms. They put in this line about the United Nations. You know, for a while there was this hope that the United Nations could become an object of affiliation. They tried the flag, right? They tried to write an anthem at a certain point. There was all these kind of like pseudo-nationalism before the UN that was supposed to be the antidote. But they never quite hit upon the formula that would allow them to empower the state to insist upon a compulsory education system, but one that did not run the risk of indoctrinating those citizens according to the will of the state. Last question then. So the final, or the last paragraph here. Parents have the prior right to choose the kind of education that shall be given to their children. This was the last thing to be inserted, and it was only inserted because of the bureaucratic acumen of its sponsor, Charles Malik. Right? He's one of the primary drafters. He had tried to get this principle in there early on, this idea that maybe parents should also have some say in the education of their children. But it was continually shot down, oftentimes from the point of view, well, this is a document about empowering individuals, and parents having a mediating role in whether their children get an education or not seems problematic. So it was shot down all the way through the Human Rights Commission deliberation. He got to chair the third committee in the General Assembly, which was the last stop on the bureaucratic train tracks toward ratification. And he was able to get this back in there by opening up debate and encouraging other, and at any rate, aligning lots of allies. So yet another example of having the gavel is really important for those of you who are thinking ahead 2 weeks. But here, the reason why he insisted on putting this in is he was trying to find another way of carving out a zone, a buffer between the experience of education, which is so intimate and so powerful, and the will to power of the state. And for him, coming from Lebanon in particular, which is a multi-confessional state in which most of the education happens along religious lines, and there's lots and lots of hand-wringing about whether or not the predominant state ethnic or religious group is going to be able to impose particular models on it, he saw parents as a proxy for community. That communities should be able to shape and influence the scope and nature of that education, precisely to ensure there are more than one set of loyalties among the citizens under these conditions. So this is all to say, right, that this article, and in fact the entire Universal Declaration, speaks in many voices. It does many things at once. And our reading of it and our understanding of its direction and its importance depends entirely on which line we want to draw, which emphasis we want to place, which lens we want to use to focus on. And I'll just end here, I'll almost end here. First I want to highlight one other place where education makes itself known, and that's in the preamble. Right? We've had all of this concern about the failure of the UN human rights system. It's the perennial perennial lament. All those quotes from the beginning of the presentation, you would find them every day and everywhere within the UN human rights system. We are always already flustered by its failure. But maybe that's because we've been barking up the wrong tree, and the drafters kind of knew this. This preamble is the operative paragraph, proclaims the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as a common standard of achievement for all people and all nations, to the end that every individual and every organ of society, keeping this declaration constantly in mind, shall strive by teaching and education to promote respect for these rights and freedoms by progressive measures, national and international, to secure their universal and effective recognition and observance, both among the peoples of and member states themselves and among the peoples and territories under their jurisdiction. The point of putting this up here is that the state was never actually the addressee of the Universal Declaration. And that can be also read as a sign of its impotence. There was much conversation in the drafting committee. They considered, well, they didn't really consider, but the Australians proposed a court, right? Eleanor Roosevelt famously had the committee declare as its first point of action it could not address actual human rights complaints, that it was only a drafting committee. And then when they got down to treaty versus a declaration, they slow-rolled the treaty in favor of the declaration, all pointing to what seems like a bad faith effort on many of their parts to make sure this was not very effective. That may be true if our lens tells us that the only import of human rights is what happens in states and governments and laws exclusively. This thing asks for something different, teaching and education. What if we took that seriously? What if we took that not as an alibi, but as a directive? What could we be studying and revealing when we look away from laws and the accomplishment of political organizations, or even away from agonistic politics as practiced by social movements who may take up human rights strategically as a cudgel to serve their interests? But what if we take it up as a model for understanding individuals in their daily lives? So I'm ending with this then. This is a picture of Eleanor about 6 weeks after she left the UN headquarters giving that speech. She's on a porch in Monteagle, Tennessee, at a place called the Highlander Folk School, which is a very famous community education center run by Miles Horton, who, if Dewey actually wanted to practice what he preached, he would have been Miles Horton. And she's here for a variety, to recognize the Highlander was under attack, essentially, as a communist viper's nest. And she was there to show solidarity and talk and speak with them. 2 years previously, the Highlander Folk School had hosted 2 workshops, summer workshops, on the United Nations and school desegregation, which is an immediate aftermath of the Brown v. Board of Education. Some of the people there included Rosa Parks, Septima Clark, Usaw Jenkins, and Bernice Robinson. And some of those names might sound familiar to some of you, but Bernice Robinson was a beautician from the Sea Islands of South Carolina. And part of what was hatched at the Highlander Folk School was the idea for the first citizenship schools. The citizenship schools are one of the most important and understudied components of the civil rights movement. And in her first class, in which she was teaching literacy to the African American inhabitants of the Sea Islands, she put up on the wall a copy of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And she told them that to graduate from this class, they had to be able to read and understand that document. I don't know what that means. I don't know where it went. I don't have the record yet of exactly how it got there, how they talked about it, what it meant, how it informed who they were or what they did. But I have a suspicion that there are hidden currents away from the front lines of politics that this discourse of human rights, this language of human rights, that these frameworks of education that were presented planted seeds that perhaps bore fruit. And so I would encourage us as historians to think again about where and how we find the relevance of political ideas and terminology and statements from on high, like the Universal Declaration. All right, thank you.
Can you hear me? Okay?
No.
No? All right, well, I'll just talk louder. Is that okay? We're good? Okay. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Katie. Thank you, Manisha. So now we're going to turn back in time from the 20th century to an earlier century, and you will see that my account differs a bit from that of Professor Moyn. Today, I will look anew at slavery and freedom, and I will argue that slave emancipation in America transformed the human rights tradition that was inherited from the age of revolution. Slave emancipation did so, I'll argue, by vindicating amusement seeking as a right belonging to all persons by virtue simply of their humanity. And therefore, I will further argue, it transformed the very conception of being human, enshrining the idea that intrinsic in a person is the right to seek amusement, to pursue pleasure, to experience rapture in public in association with others, and that this right must be encoded in the positive will of the nation state. This was a revolutionary transformation of Enlightenment understandings of human rights and of humanity itself that were rooted in proprietorship and wealth accumulation and freedom. I will make this argument by exploring the Civil Rights Act of 1875, a law that was intended as the culminating decree of the congressional destruction of slavery. According to the act, the nullification of slavery entailed the right to be an amusement seeker, and still more peculiarly and more particularly, the right to be a theater goer. It was an idea of freedom both sensuous and soaked in the marketplace and nowhere to be found in prior declarations of the rights of man and citizen. My evidence comes from the theater of politics, debates in Congress. It also concerns the world of the stage, the theater itself, and what connected the Capitol and the Playhouse, lawmaking and social experience was the outcry of ex-slaves and free black persons against the violation of their human dignity. So my evidence also is their words. But let's begin with the language of the 1875 Civil Rights Act. It said, quote, "All persons within the jurisdiction of the United States shall be entitled to the full and equal enjoyment of the accommodations, advantages, facilities, and privileges of inns, public conveyances on land or water, theaters, and other places of public amusement." By no means was this an aesthetic article of freedom. And what interested me about the demo is theaters and in public amusements doing in the last act of Reconstruction, the last act of slave emancipation. Theaters, amusement, why? Okay, the 1875 Act was grounded on the 13th and 14th Amendments. It was intended to eliminate all vestiges of slavery. It figured in the rights aspirations not only of freed people in the South, but of freeborn blacks across the country. And it was enacted by a Congress, this is important, in which sat both ex-slaves and ex-Confederates. Famously, the United States Supreme Court struck down the law as unconstitutional and encroachment on state sovereignty. That was in the 1883 civil rights cases. It wasn't until a century later, in the 1964 Civil Rights Act, that the pleasurable entitlements of public amusement seeking were resurrected. Now, my purpose here today is not to join scholarly disputes about the value of searching the past for precursors of contemporary human rights doctrine. Nor is my purpose to deny the paradox of human rights that are rooted in the sovereignty of the nation. The paradox revealed in Arendt's classic study, The Rights of Man That Hinge on Citizenship. Nonetheless, my argument about slave emancipation does challenge scholarship on the human rights tradition, the finding that the language of human rights did not emerge until the era of the Holocaust. My study of slavery and abolition indicates my study indicates otherwise, that invocations of human rights figured profoundly in the making of slave emancipation. But the issue is finally not one of semantics. My point is that slave emancipation renovated the rights of man, that it formed a turning point in the emergence of human rights. In the 1875 Civil Rights Act, we see this. In the act lay the new idea that the rights intrinsic to being human included pursuing amusement in public and even beholding the imaginary world created on stage. The legislation spoke in universalist terms of all persons, and the freedoms it guaranteed were nowhere found in prior natural rights declarations, not in revolutionary America, not in France, not in Haiti. Under the 1875 Act, the rights bearer did not figure as a citizen, as homo economicus, or as a contract maker, or as a possessive individual. My argument is that from the revolution of abolition, the transition of the slave from property to person emerged the affirmation of passionate, pleasurable, and non-acquisitive freedom as the negation of chattel slavery. Here was something new in the history of human rights. Habermas has written that the appeal to human rights insists on an inviolable, quote, domain of free will, that it originated in the outcry of the humiliated against insults to their dignity. And in the 1875 Civil Rights Act, we see this too. A former slave named John Roy Lynch, who had once picked cotton but became a Mississippi congressman, put it simply. This bill, he told the United States House of Representatives, quote, has for its object the protection of human rights, end quote. Time doesn't allow tracing how the theater, once an illicit place, a place of blasphemy that excited unruly passions, came to represent the domain of free will. So just a word about the theater itself. There had never been a right to go to a playhouse, or even a customary entitlement to seek public amusement. Indeed, after the abolition of slavery, directly after that, black people were still excluded from theaters or kept separate in the upper galleries, owing to the liberty of property owners to regulate their private associations that were open to the public. This was the rule across the country in the North and South. Listen to the words of those who sought passage of the 1875 Act, the meaning they ascribed to it. Consider an appeal uttered by a free-born black man who had led colored troops during the Civil War. He spoke of once viewing The Merchant of Venice, and he attested, quote, to, quote, rights and feelings, to a sentience that distinguished him from a group in appreciating works of art. He said, quote, I feel keenly. Shylock's words depict the feelings that animate with great intensity that outraged colored man. I am not demanding a pound of human flesh, he said, but I am demanding exact justice as denominated in the bond between me and my government, end quote. Listen to a letter from a Virginia ex-slave to Senator Charles Sumner. The freedman wrote to him, quote, "Look at the white man and the black man. They both have one bone, one blood. If I pay my money at a place of public entertainment, it is as good as if a white man paid his at the same place. All that are sacred will be found in one heaven." End quote. Consider the argument of Senator Sumner, the author of the 1875 Act, setting forth the new proposition that seeking amusement at a theater was a human right. Sumner declared, quote, "The slave is free, no longer a chattel. He longs perhaps for respite and relaxation at some place of amusement." End quote. Of the theater, Senator Sumner said, quote, "Here are institutions whose peculiar object is the pursuit of happiness, which has been placed among the equal rights of all." End quote. His bill, Sumner proclaimed, was, quote, "truly efficacious for human rights." End quote. Let's now turn to Congress for a moment. In the era of slave emancipation, the U.S. Congress became a theater of debate over human rights. Before the Civil War, as Manisha, Professor Sinha showed, the language of human rights had sometimes emerged in strife over slavery extension, the slave trade, the fugitive slave law. With emancipation, this language became more pronounced, especially in the adoption of the anti-slavery amendments. And in the debate on the 1875 Act, which dragged on for more than 3 years, the usage intensified. Congress became a forum for the outcry of the humility against violations of their personhood. A freeborn black congressman from South Carolina, Alonzo Rozier, quoted resolutions sent by his state legislature where black men then held sway, men who called for the bill to end, quote, "the violation of their rights as human beings." And quoting from Macbeth, Rozier rebuked former slave owners for their opposition to the law, prophesying that one day their claim would falsely be, quote, "Thou canst not say I did it, never shake thy gory locks at me," end quote. Appeals for the bill flooded into the Capitol from both ex-slave and freeborn black petitioners, appeals that were then read into the record, a petition from 4,000 colored persons in Georgia, a memorial from a mass meeting of 3,000 black men in Pennsylvania. Consider the words of a Georgia freedman read aloud by Sumner, who described being a pariah as an inheritance of slavery and demanded recognition of the human dignity of ex-slaves. Quote, "In whatever direction we go, in public places of amusement, we encounter this inhuman outrage upon our manhood. We are weary of being treated as outcasts," end quote. An interchange thus developed between the outcry of the aggrieved and congressional lawmakers. It was out of that charged interchange that the logic of the 1875 Act took shape, an anti-slavery amendment to the rights declarations of the age of revolution. The Act did more than eradicate the color line, right? It did more than end Jim Crow. It codified new freedoms. The ideal of happiness itself was amplified by the Act as an end to be sought by rights bearers. It did not involve individual property accumulation and wealth creation, or a rational calculus of pain or pleasure, or works of benevolence, or the felicities of a well-constituted state, the forms of happiness theorized by Enlightenment thinkers. Newly, the legislation defined the right to seek non-acquisitive forms of happiness, the sensuous pleasures of the theater, once considered sinful, as the antithesis of slavery. It gave the force of the American nation state to the profound longing expressed in the pleas of black petitioners, and it broadened the domain of free will protected by law. Just for a moment, let us turn to the debate over the bill in the House of Representatives, where black statesmen and former slaveholders argued as equal over the vindication of human rights. The words of a former Confederate leader, Congressman Hiram Bell of Georgia, summed up the condemnation of theater-going as a right of masterless men, of amusement seeking by ex-slaves. The Southerner said, quote, "It would be disgusting to us in our social relationships," and, quote, "divert the Negro from the pursuit of honest industry." In other words, ex-slaves should be at work, no amusement seeking for free theater. But consider the language of the slave-born Florida Congressman Josiah Walls. Justifying the bill, he spoke of, quote, "liberty, equality, and fraternity as the watchword of people seeking a higher plane of manhood," end quote. Consider the outcry of the freeborn Congressman Alonzo Ranzier, who had spoken of Banquo's glory logs. He said, quote, "We are circumscribed within the narrowest possible limits on every hand, disowned, spit upon, and outraged. We cannot engage in the pursuit of happiness as rational beings," end quote. And consider the words of a freeborn black congressman from South Carolina, Robert Elliott, as he denied the authority of apostles of slavery to oppose the bill. He rebuked the ex-rebel Alexander Stephens, whom amnesty had returned to Congress. And Elliott cried out against him, quote, "It is not from him that the House of Representatives should take lessons in matters touching human rights," end quote. Thus, the debate on the legislation became a form of revolutionary drama, as the conflict of words and the antagonism of wills expressed the upheaval of abolitionists. A decade after the end of the Civil War, the Civil Rights Bill was at last enacted by Congress. Some of the final words on its meaning were pronounced by the Alabama Congressman James Rapier, a freeborn black man. He said, quote, "This question resolves itself into this: either I am a man or I am not a man," end quote. The final act of this story is well known. In 1883, the Supreme Court struck down the law as unconstitutional, declaring that it had no grounding in either the 13th or 14th Amendment. To uphold the statute, the court famously ruled, quote, "would be running the slavery argument into the ground," unquote. Less well known is the eulogy of Frederick Douglass on the legislation. Douglass spoke bitterly of human rights and slavery and the rule of law. Douglass said, quote, "Oh, for a Supreme Court which shall be as true, as vigilant, as maintaining law enacted for the protection of human rights, as in other days was that court for the destruction of human rights," end quote. And one final point on human rights and the legacy of slave emancipation. A century after the downfall of slavery, the ethos of the 1875 Act was resurrected. Under the 1964 Civil Rights Act, Congress again entitled all persons, irrespective of race, color, or creed, to the equal enjoyment of the theater as well as other places of public amusement, movie houses, concert halls, stadiums. Notably, however, the 1964 Act was grounded not in the anti-slavery 13th Amendment, safeguarding the freedom of human beings. Rather, it was grounded in a Commerce Clause regulating the traffic in commodities, and if state action were involved, in the 14th Amendment. Paradoxically, as America celebrated the centennial of slave emancipation, human rights newly came to theater goers and amusement seekers by virtue of the untraveled flow of commerce. The story I've told today, what happened in the age of slave emancipation, wasn't everything. Certainly, it was not enough, but it was something, a moment that transformed the history of human rights.
I'd like to thank all our presenters for these really interesting and provocative papers. Samuel Moyn set out this broad theoretical perspective on what he thinks has been the tragic history of human rights. And I think the others sort of filled in the very particular moments in history from different areas, different time periods, on what human rights meant and how it was reconstituted at these particular moments. And I think it's really interesting to see how much actually the presentations spoke to each other, more than I thought that they would, right?
And always hope.
Exactly. I mean, I heard Manu speak and the history of Jim Crow, segregation, the liberating sojourn abroad and coming back to homegrown oppressions. I mean, it's a familiar story for most Americanists, at least certainly most African Americanists. And just looking at all the connections between the history of Reconstruction and also 20th century iterations of this. Education, I kept thinking about the fact that it is former slaves during Reconstruction who sort of introduced the common school system in the South. Common South C education as right. There's so many connections there. But I won't go on because I, of course, will have the pleasure of talking to all of our presenters later on. But I do invite questions and discussions here. I know some of you are here from classes that look at these distinct periods or the topic. But I'm sure that our presenters would love to address your questions and perhaps talk to each other a little bit too when they're answering those questions. So, any questions? Katie is here with a handy mic.
Thank you. Chris Clark. Hi, Amy. I'm sorry I arrived late, so I only heard Amy and Glenn's papers, but there's a question for both of them posed by the topics of both of their papers. And it's a naive question, but maybe an important one. Why is education not part of the American civil rights legislation, either in the 1870s or in the 1960s?
I can answer that. Can you hear me? I can answer that. It was the bill. There were so many things in this bill. There were so many things in this bill. It was a whole list. Education was in there. A right to be in cemeteries, churches. They took out churches because of the First Amendment. Cemeteries went, and education they flipped out. And they kept on saying, "My God, if you have little black boys and white girls sitting next together, they're going to rape them." So education went as being too incendiary. What you have left in is inns, railroads and steamboats, and theaters and public amusements. And I sat there and I taught this, every American Civ at the University of Chicago. I taught this. I looked at this list of things and I just kept on thinking, why are theaters? And what was interesting is I won't go into it, but on the one hand, people were saying, like some are defenders, this is incredibly important. It's a human right. To be not a slave means not just you work or you contract, you have a right to property, you have a right to have fun. I mean, literally, to have fun. But the Southerners also said not only that it was horrifying, but they said this is absurd. who would have ever thought that a theater belonged in an enactment of Reconstruction? And there's a whole debate, like what kind of theater you're talking about, like, you know, Punch and Judy shows or high shows, and they're sitting there debating, you know, for some of the absurdity that this law should be in. But that's education went out as being too contested.
So Glenn, how did you get back into Universal?
In the UDHR?
Yeah.
Again, because it was everywhere. I don't think it was
Thanks to non-Americans.
Yeah, primarily. But then the American level too. I mean, it survived one place in American national politics after the Second World War in the form of a right. That's the GI Bill of Rights, right? So that legislation provided for a massive increase in institutions like this, as a matter of fact, by imagining that part of what the society owed its veterans was access to education. So, but I mean, there's all kinds of complicated reasons why it doesn't appear elsewhere in a variety of federal legislation. But it's a thread that's woven.
Absolutely, second what Amy said, the 1875 Act is passed precisely with it covers school integration, right? That was really fantastic. Any more questions?
I'm Kathy Leibel, and I was fascinated with the breadth of the panel and intrigued about what the panelists might think about these kind of competing ideological currents of promoting the developmentalist state, especially pre-World War II. So the precursor to what would be welfarism, the kind of the primacy of education, the primacy of, you know, healthcare, and the other core social institutions that were seen as strengthening the state, and how that edged up against or competed with rights-based mobilizations. The context I think about is post-World War I Turkey, where as they made an effort to, as they would put it, not be colonized again, really tried to put in place many of the institutions they saw as strengthening European states. And so there was always this tension between, was it really about rights? And if so, how is rights doing the work of strengthening the state to forestall the invasion and the occupation of others?
Anyone else want to take that? I don't need to set over that.
Well, I'm the least qualified, but at least compared to Manu, he can take it. But I would say, you know, it's a fantastic question which would have to be studied unless we really ascend to a very high level of abstraction and talk about the developmentalist state in general. In sources I've seen, the leaders of developmentalist states generally made arguments in the United Nations, like about the postponement of human rights enforcement until, let's say, they were ready, until development had taken place, and until a time in the future when not just civil liberties, but economic and social rights for individuals could accrue. And even when you look at, you know, people in the global north, a great example would be the great liberal philosopher John Rawls. What's interesting is how long into the post-war period even friends of freedom are willing to tolerate that argument for postponement. And so my own argument about the explosion of human rights discourse generally is really about how people give up their willingness to indulge the developmentalist state, and you know, it's infringement of, again, not just the rights of individuals to free speech and so on, but also, you know, like the poor who were neglected, you know, by and large by the developmentalist state until the 1970s. And a lot of the rise of human rights discourse is about saying, no, you know, given the failures of development, these rights of both kinds need to accrue now, and we need to enforce them starting soon.
Thank you for your question. I've been mulling an answer. It's confused in my head, so let me see if I can make it as clear as possible. I'd say it's very complicated. I'd say that they're in the pre-independence period or the interwar period leading through World War II in India. I'd say that there are probably three different strands of, sorry, is this on? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, okay. There's Gandhi and Gandhiism. Gandhi is not a developmentalist. You know, his goal is rule by villages. And he is anti-modern in many ways. He sees problems with all of industrialism, with the hospitals, with lawyers. He's a lawyer. So he sees problems with all of this. He doesn't necessarily believe in going back to sort of an ancient kind of thing, but he is really concerned about sort of grounding local industries, local handicraft work, and local societies. To some extent, matched up against him is Nehru. Nehru is a developmentalist and a socialist. He's a Fabian socialist. And he sees these two things as linked. So, to Sam's point, I mean, I think that that Nehru in this period really is sort of broader questions about equality, economic equality, and the ways in which you bring this forward. After 1947, when India is independent and he becomes prime minister, he's advocating economic and social rights as something that is in line with this view that he has, but exactly as Sam said, in keeping in mind that impositions on newly decolonizing or poorer states which still need to develop is an unfair burden, and so they have to give some leeway to them to grow in order to be able to deliver these things. Against these two poles, I would pitch Ambedkar, who thinks that neither Gandhi nor Nehru are particularly concerned enough with the oppressed in his case being Dalits, but that's a stand-in category for a large group of people. And neither socialism, Nehruvian socialism, nor Gandhiism is sufficient in his view, because they're simply not, their position is not coming from that of negating caste from Ambedkar's view, and caste then is again an example of larger trends of oppression throughout society. So I'd say those are the three trends, and then they go forward. Ambedkar's, therefore, is pitched in the language of human rights.
Any more questions, comments? Yes.
Hi. I'm wondering whether there's anything in the history or any ideas you may have about possible underpinnings for access to the human right to access to energy, and the intersection of that with the human right to a safe environment as a proposal, keeping in mind that actual access to energy arguments have been made by fossil fuel industries. So how is that, is there any idea on that?
That's an interesting question. If you think of the expansion of human rights as even pleasure seeking or amusement, and you think of it maybe in its modern iterations, you think of the consumers, etc. But anyone willing to take that on? This is where the individual versus the global.
It's a great question. There have been tons of turning points in the history of human rights where groups have articulated new rights, and certainly the right to, a healthy environment has been propounded. It's just it hasn't been canonized, obviously, by powerful enough people or in binding law, let alone pursuing it. And that's, as I would see it, because the field of human rights is not a field of human rights and enemies of human rights. It's a field of different people claiming different rights. And so in the energy field, just as in Amy's example, this newfangled human right is cut off by another human rights movement. In Amy's case, it's those in the civil rights cases who interpret that phrase to exclude associational rights, so-called social rights at that time. And in your case, it's more powerful energy companies than environmental movements to date. And so we just have to see the history of human rights as, in both of these cases, as about not just the people we would like to win, but the people who do win.
I just, a quick add-on, which is, I don't know how far this has gone from the time that they did it, but Bolivia, a few years ago, enacted a law to protect the human right of Mother Earth. And I think that there's a whole series of similar environmental type human rights which have been coming out of Latin America. I don't know enough about it, unfortunately, to give you sort of a definitive answer. But my friend and colleague Mark Edelman does work on areas like this, so you could look him up and presumably follow up on this.
So were you saying that the energy companies are articulating the idea that they have a right to drill in certain areas as a human right? Is that what that is?
I actually had the experience where the former executive director of Duke Energy indicated that the 1 billion or so people who currently lack access to energy should be able to deploy coal combustion generation in order to quickly and cheaply, allegedly, get to energize and provide for basic needs.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, that strikes me as like the tobacco companies talking about your human right to flavor country or something, right? I mean, it's so transparently self-serving that it's ridiculous on its face. So, I mean, not that things that are ridiculous on their face suddenly become the law of the land, but you know, it stretches the idea of the plasticity of human rights to kind of absurd level.
I think some of the discussions around the Paris Climate Accords were exactly around this, and was done in a global scale with developing countries versus developed countries, talking about this access to energy development versus environmental costs. But I think that another way to frame it, I was thinking about this as Sam was speaking, is having a narrow conception of individual human rights. So everyone has a right to energy or the right to have an iPhone or whatever they may choose to have, versus a sense of human rights as a collective and its environmental costs. I think those are very differing conceptions of human rights, you know, and maybe some of the work here that's been done, including Sam's 2 books, actually points towards those narrow visions versus larger visions. I don't know that. Any other questions for our panelists? Suggestions, questions, any last minute? Yeah, no? Yes, Fiona. Great.
I wanted to ask the panelists if they could. Oh, sorry. I wanted to ask the panelists if they could think through all of their formulations based on what Dr. Moyn started off with as lost opportunities, or what was lost. So lost egalitarianism, lost social rights. So kind of help me think of this idea of what was lost and maybe leave us some optimistic note. Like, what are the possibilities of what can be gained out of these moments?
Well, I think what I've told is an account of an expansion, a transformation, an opening, the attempt to enact in legislation, the failure due to the Supreme Court, and then a victory a century later because of another social movement and uprising. So you can see that there's nothing lost. It was gained, it just took a century. But I guess I would say that something was lost because the enactment originally, after the Civil War, was an anti-slavery, right? It was framed in terms of the human rights based on the nullification of slavery. A century later, we could say, well, what difference does it make what it's enacted under? A century later, it was enacted under the Commerce Clause, right? So that, in other words, to deny people places of accommodation or access to theaters is an interference with the free flow of commerce. And I think that that is a much narrower conception of the human by linking the human to the needs of commerce and the flow of commerce, what affects the flow of commerce, rather than a vision of that this is an emancipatory act that comes out of the abolition of slavery. So even in certain ways, if you end up with certain of the same protections, the logic and the framing and the moral ethos of them, something is lost in how we think about humanity, not in terms of anti-slavery, but in terms of the needs of commerce, the spirit of commerce.
Yeah, optimism's tough. Maybe because I spend too much time lurking on Twitter, but my feeling is like we're on the precipice of losing it all. So there's not a lot of hope necessarily to be found. But I will say, one kind of indication of what was lost. I think these possibilities around education were quite open and being pursued on a number of lines in the immediate post-war period. The National Council for the Social Studies, produced a series of issues of their journal in the late 1940s that were kind of developing a set of resources and practices and standards around human rights education. We're talking about it as a kind of robust antidote to some of the nationalism that was being pushed in the interwar period. All that stuff got completely shut down, both because of the anti-communist purges, as well as the intervention by the federal government to pump tons of money into STEM fields and to kind of boost the scientific literacy of America's youths. But I will say it squeezed into some interesting corners, and that's kind of what I'm interested in. So there's that citizenship schools. There's a school called the Oakwood School in California that was started in the early 1950s that took on these principles in reaction to that. There's the Ethical Culture Societies started a series of summer camps in New York, which were all very interesting and set up a series of intercultural practices based on human rights. So no loss. Well, not no loss. Most losses aren't total. Right? They drive them into the corners, into the margins, and they have to be slowly excavated and uncovered by dedicated individuals. And I think that's part of the story of human rights, is that they lay fallow for periods of time, but then they sprout under the right ecological conditions.
Can I say, actually I want to say, but there is a cause for optimism, because who was more vulnerable? Who was more disenfranchised and lacked property than ex-slaves before the 15th Amendment? They were not disenfranchised, take that as wrong. And again, so I guess the lesson here is the optimism is it took a social movement to bring to bear, to force Congress to enact this in 1875. And again, it was another social movement of people agitating, demonstrating, facing the police that brought the Civil Rights Act in 1964. So you guys, go vote, right? You want some optimism? Go vote. Make your Congress speak to and enact and adhere to human rights. That's the beginning. You have to agitate and create movement on the ground that will be then enacted into law. So there's some optimism.
I agree with Amy that the main remedy is voting, that you have to vote for the right side.
Well,
It's a wonderful question. I just would, just as a couple of cautionary notes, not all things that were lost should be reclaimed. Most things were lost for a good reason. And so we have to figure out what things are worth recovering. I think there's huge merit in all the three other presentations than mine, because they show us that there were, let's call them alt-rights, alternative visions of rights that are worth reclaiming. But not all good things have been framed in terms of human rights. And not all things can be recovered, because there's just a lot of good that has never been brought about. And so with that said, I think the history of human rights is worth studying for lost possibilities, but that's never going to help us figure out what exactly we should strive for in the future.
Well, I would just say that we're at a precarious moment. As Glenn says, we're in danger of losing it all. But from bouncing off of Sam's presentation, that may not necessarily be a bad thing, because what we're in danger of losing itself was deeply flawed and has come up short in so many ways, and very much tied to a particularly contemporary neoliberal project, which has short-shrifted a much broader kind of egalitarian agenda, if I can paraphrase what I think is your broad points. But I do think that there is value, therefore, in thinking about much more radical ideas that have long been invested in ideas of human rights, whether or not that specific term was used, or whether some other formulation that implied the same thing was, so that we can imagine radical new possibilities for the future. I mean, I think that's the key. I mean, we need to broaden our imagination. We don't need to be limited in our scope. And the peril and the promise of the moment right now is that up until this point, we've all been committed to an incrementalist approach. There are problems, we need to target those problems and think about reforms and try to change them point by point in ways that are directed to those problems. Now, with the whole thing being potentially upended, it's a kind of revolutionary moment. Of course, things could go into terrible direction, but it's up to us, I think, to create the space to ensure that they move also as a possibility in a much more positive direction, and that's still an open possibility at this time.
I guess I'd say one other thing. There's a certain sense that, well, things are getting better. In America, things keep on getting better. There's expansion, egalitarianism, opening up. I think we look ahead and we see fascism coming in this country. And so I think that the fight for egalitarian, economic, distributive justice is absolutely central, but so too is civil liberties, because they're so under attack. So we have to battle on two fronts, and I think that that's, human rights involves both the material and traditional liberal formal rights.
I think that's actually a wonderful note to end this workshop on, because I think what we've gotten is sort of more robust understandings of human rights, even ideas about national belonging that Manu mentioned in his presentation, and that Frederick Douglass actually gives voice to a lot. It's not just a matter of citizenship rights, it's national belonging, and Steve Kantrowitz actually makes that claim in a recent book. But I go back to Amy and say, I don't need you to love me. Just don't kill me, or don't do anything that. I think that tradition of rights is also important, and to throw out the baby with the bathwater, I don't know whether I'm willing to do that either. So I think what we have here are these very sort of interesting, broader conceptions of human rights, but also something that compels us back to ideas about natural rights and human rights in the 19th century. New visions that I think are probably worth reclaiming too, and not doing. So that's I get the last word as the moderator. I took it. Thank you.